The Great War was over. On the 11th of November 1918, an armistice had been signed. In Britain and France, the survivors celebrated victory, the return of peace and the end of bloodshed. They'd left behind the nightmare lands of death and destruction created by 4 years of war. The cost of those years was almost beyond imagination, but somehow, somewhere, that cost would have to be counted. And the defeated would have to pay the price of peace. To the west of Paris stands the great palace of Versailles. It was here that the peace treaty with Germany would eventually be signed. But before that could happen, much had to be decided. In January 1919, 2 months after the armistice, the delegates of the victorious powers arrived in Paris for the peace conference to draw up the terms to be offered to the defeated countries. In all, the representatives of 27 nations attended that conference. But of all the statesmen who came to Paris to settle the peace, the most important were President Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau, the French Premier, and Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain. Each had very different ideas of what to do about the central problem of Germany. Clemenceau, like most Frenchmen, knew what he wanted out of the peace: revenge, reparations for the damage the French had suffered, and guarantees that a similar war would never, could never happen again. The idea that Germany should be let off lightly would have seemed sheer madness to Frenchmen who'd seen the effects of the German war machine on their own country. In order that scenes like this could never happen again, they wanted a Germany stripped of her wealth and armed forces. In contrast, Woodrow Wilson appeared to promise a just and lasting peace, not punishment. Europe acclaimed him as the great and good man from the New World. This was because his 14 points seemed to promise a new moral order in international affairs. No more secret diplomacy, reduction in armaments, and a League of Nations to protect all countries from aggression. He didn't want revenge as the French did, but there was no question that Germany should get off scot-free. But while Wilson was planning the future of Europe, Americans were rapidly losing interest as their boys came back home. They wanted a peace that wouldn't involve them in European affairs. Surprisingly, it was Lloyd George who fought most strongly for German interests at Versailles. Behind him was a public elated by victory, but eager for revenge. The Prime Minister appeared to share their opinion, but really had no time for those who wanted to destroy Germany. What mattered to him was that Germany should be made stable and allowed to recover her strength as a trading partner. This was the kind of Germany he feared, a land of miserable refugees, poverty, homelessness and starvation. All conditions likely to provide a perfect breeding ground for the new disease from the East, communism. In Berlin, his fears had already been realized. A communist revolt had broken out there in early January. While the leaders tried to rouse the mass of the people, armed communists occupied key public buildings. This was a direct challenge to Ebert, acting president of the new German government. He had to turn for support to army generals who brought in bands of ex-soldiers and turned them loose on the communists. Berlin briefly became a battlefield. Within a week, the revolt was crushed. Communist leaders were rounded up and some brutally murdered. Post-war politics in Germany were off to a bloody start. Meanwhile, in Paris, whilst the German government was squashing the threat to its own existence, the Allied leaders were arguing their way over the whole future of the German people. Under their hands, the map of Europe was drawn and redrawn again. At last, after more than 3 months of discussion, they presented the terms of their treaty to the Germans. Germany lost land in the east, the west, and the north. In the east, the most important of those losses was the wide strip of territory given to the newly independent Poland, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. While on the west, France took back the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, and was also given the right to mine coal in the Saar, an area placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. To protect France, Germany was forbidden to station soldiers in the Rhineland, an area which was to be occupied by Allied troops until 1935. It was not only the loss of territory which Germany resented, but also the fact that Czechoslovakia and Poland now contained large numbers of Germans. And as if to add insult to injury, the treaty forbade German-speaking Austria to unite with Germany. Her fortifications were to be destroyed. Her army was to be reduced to 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines, and to accept blame for starting the war and pay reparations. In protest at Scapa Flow, the British naval base, the Germans scuttled their fleet rather than hand it over to the Allies. It was a last defiant gesture. Germany would have to agree to the terms. She was in no position to restart the war. So, in the high summer of 1919, the German delegates were brought to the Great Hall of Mirrors at Versailles to sign the peace treaty. It was a compromise peace that satisfied not even one single Allied leader, and predictably the Germans loathed it. Inside Germany, the people had been faced with difficult political choices. The Communists had already tried and failed to wreck the government. Other parties suggested a variety of ways of dealing with Germany's problems. But when Ebert became president of the new German Republic in August 1919, he found himself facing other threats. There were, for instance, the extreme nationalists who couldn't bring themselves to believe that the German army had lost the war and often greeted returning troops as heroes. They'd already blamed the government for signing the armistice, and now they blamed them for signing the shameful Treaty of Versailles. And then there were the Freikorps, or Free Corps, bands of ex-servicemen who'd tasted blood and power in their battles with the Communists. In March 1920, these two forces combined to try and take over Berlin. The army refused to fire on the Freikorps, who were only defeated when the workers of Berlin went on strike and refused to cooperate with the rebels. Political extremism seemed to have become part of everyday life. And then there was the vital question of reparations. In 1921, the Allies were still discussing how much Germany should finally pay. Aristide Briand, the French Prime Minister, wanted a definite sum to be fixed quickly, and Germany made to pay. The rebuilding of war-damaged France was costing the country a great deal of money. Why should the French be taxed more heavily to pay for all this, when the money could be squeezed out of Germany? But the Germans, who'd been summoned to hear the Allied demands, protested that these would place an intolerable burden on their people. They'd argued that the Germany to which they were returning had suffered poverty and unemployment in the years since the war and couldn't afford the vast sums demanded by the Allies. Germany was already in a bitter mood. Might not reparations only make things worse? But these arguments didn't impress the Allies, who fixed a sum of £6,600 million for the Germans to pay. That sum would have to be paid in goods as well as money. Most would come from here in the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. But at the end of 1922, the Germans fell behind with their payments, and Raymond Poincaré, the new French Prime Minister, decided to act. If Germany wouldn't pay in full and on the nail, then France would help herself. So, on the 11th of January 1923, French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr to force the Germans to pay up. There was, of course, after Versailles, no German army big enough to stop them. At first, the French believed that they could make the Germans work for them. But suddenly, German politicians and people were united in a common cause, hatred of the French, and huge protest meetings were held all over Germany. Workers in the Ruhr refused to cooperate with the enemy, and the German government supported the strikers. Germany's industrial heart stopped beating, and the goods trains, which should have been carrying German wealth to France, lay idle in the sidings. The French hit back by bringing in their own workers to get things moving again. Their attitude towards the Germans in the Ruhr began to harden. They tried to cut the Ruhr off from the rest of the country. German visitors were searched as if they were entering a foreign land. They deported the leaders of the passive resistance, German officials, and even the police. The result was violence. German workers had been killed in riots at Essen in March. Their funeral was turned into a vast demonstration of protest. Hatred grew. Germans began killing French soldiers, and at the funeral for one of them, tempers flared into acts of brutality. "1923 was disastrous for Germany. In that year, the great German inflation reached its peak. For some time, the value of the mark had been dropping, and as the value of the notes decreased, so the amount of notes needed to buy things grew. Banks became more and more hard-pressed to meet the ever-increasing demand for paper money. For their customers, suitcases replaced wallets. To meet this crisis and pay the strikers in the Ruhr, the government simply printed more money. And as it lost its value, so it cost more and more to pay wages, to buy food. Hundreds of thousands. Millions, whatever figure was printed on the notes, really meant nothing. The German mark was worthless. As in a fearful dream, people's life savings were blown away like leaves in a gale. As Germany slid towards disaster, Gustav Stresemann was appointed Chancellor. It was a time of crisis. The loss of production in the Ruhr was making inflation even worse, and Stresemann realized that the only way to help the economy back to normal was to call off resistance there and get production going again. The government also announced that Germany would resume the payment of reparations. It was the only possible way of getting the French out. But to the nationalists, it looked like yet another pathetic surrender to Germany's enemies. General Ludendorff, who'd never accepted that Germany had been defeated, gave his support to Adolf Hitler, the leader of the new National Socialist Party. In Munich, the capital of Bavaria, they decided to try and overthrow the government. But Hitler's stormtroopers were not yet powerful enough and couldn't get the support of the army or the police. Their November uprising failed and merely ended in confusion and 14 deaths. Ludendorff and Hitler were put on trial for treason. Ludendorff was let off. Hitler was sent to prison, where he brooded on his failure for a few months in rather comfortable surroundings. Meanwhile, inflation was being brought under control. The old worthless money was called in and destroyed, and replaced by a new currency. At the same time, a committee under Charles Dawes, an American, was set up by the Allies to scale down the reparations, so that Germany could afford to pay them. The German leaders came to London in 1924, and agreed to accept the Dawes Plan. Stresemann's policy of cooperation began to pay off at that meeting. The French agreed to pull out of the Ruhr within a year. Their occupation had been unpopular with their most important allies, especially Britain, who'd refused to support their attempt to humiliate Germany. As German industry returned to normal after the chaos of occupation and inflation, Stresemann brought off another triumph, this time at Locarno in Switzerland. Under the Locarno Pact of 1925, France, Belgium and Germany agreed to respect the frontiers between them, and Britain said she'd support any country that was invaded. Old enmities seemed to be disappearing, and Germany no longer feared the threat of a French invasion. Finally, at Geneva in September 1926, Germany became a full member of the League of Nations. Aristide Briand, now Foreign Minister of France, welcomed Stresemann as an equal. It was all very friendly. By now, life in Germany appeared to be returning to normal. The Germans relaxed. The grim aftermath of the war, the humiliation of Versailles, the hysteria of 1923, all gradually faded beneath the surface of a new prosperity. For a defeated nation still paying for a lost war, the Germans appeared not to be doing badly.